Hello, welcome back to another episode of the Leading Yourself podcast. On today's podcast episode, we're going to be talking about personal growth and development. I'm going to share with you the way that I go about creating my own personal growth plan and how to avoid personal development, burnout, and paralysis. Let's dig into today's episode. Welcome to the Leading Yourself podcast. This is your host, Carolina de Arriba. I'm an HR professional, health and fitness coach, wife, mom, and above all things, a goal-getter. In this podcast, we're going to be digging into all things leadership, professional and career development, habits, and relationships. This is a podcast for those who want to become the best version of themselves. Those who have big dreams and are willing to embrace the journey and put in the work to achieve them. My goal is to share with you the tools, tips, and tricks to help you in your journey. So let's dig into today's episode. Okay, I want to start by sharing a little story, not a story, but just my experience. A few years ago, I started to really focus on my personal development. I became obsessed with personal development. Obsessed is a strong word, but I think it's appropriate. I would sign up to any training that came my way. Any time that I would get an email with an invitation to a webinar or a training, especially if they were free, I would sign up to all of them. All of them. I would hear someone talking about a book, and I would go and buy the book and read the book. Someone would recommend a podcast, and I will go and listen to the podcast. And I would spend more than an hour a day, probably, focused on my personal growth. And one day, as I was doing, I think it was a year-end reflection, and I was reflecting on the year that was ending and reflecting on my personal development and my personal growth. And at first, I'm like, well, this year I grew a lot. Obviously, I've read, I don't know how many books I read at that time that year. But let me tell you, by the way, reading books became kind of a competition against myself. I'm competitive in nature, so it was just natural for me to compete against myself on how many books am I going to read this year? And how many more books can I read than the year before? Anyways, I was sitting at the end of the year doing the self-reflection and thinking about, okay, I must have grown a lot this year because I've invested a lot of time. I read so many books. I've listened to so many podcasts. I've taken so many trainings. I've attended so many events. And when I started getting past the surface level, I realized that I didn't grow much. And I started to think, what am I doing wrong? Like, I've read all the books that they recommended. I listened to the podcasts that I heard from people, from mentors, from people that I admire, from role models. And why is that I'm not getting any traction? Why is that I'm not making any progress? So that was the start of me becoming more intentional about my growth. That year that I spent so many hours, over 300 hours that year, quote unquote, focus on my personal development, I was doing it very accidentally. What I mean is I did not had a plan. Like I said, I would read any book that I would heard was worth reading. I would listen to any podcast that someone would recommend. I would take any training that came my way, thinking that by spending more time reading and attending trainings and listening to podcasts, I would grow and I would come closer to become that version of myself that I wanted to become. So, what I decided to be more intentional is to develop my own growth plan. And what I want to do today is walk you through how that looks like. And I think that if you want to grow, the very first thing that you need to do is that commitment with yourself that you're going to grow intentionally. And this is very important because without the commitment, it's not going to happen. Personal growth is super important. For some people, more than for others, but it's important. But it's not urgent. We talked about the time matrix on a previous episode. And if you're not intentional about your growth, the day to day is going to take over the best of your energy and your time. And you're always going to be pushing out your personal growth and not getting to it. So the very first thing is to make a commitment to yourself that you're going to grow intentionally. And immediately after that, make that commitment public. You know, we're not the best at keeping promises to ourselves. As human beings, we're much better at keeping promises to others than we are at keeping promises to ourselves. So making our commitment public increases automatically our accountability. The moment that you share with someone what you're committing to, no matter what it is, in this case is your growth, you're going to become so much more accountable to stick to it and do what you say you're going to do. And please know that at this point, I still don't have a growth plan. I still haven't even start talking about how that growth plan is going to look like. And I'm telling you to go and tell the world or tell your friends or tell your family or your colleagues or whoever you pick that you are committing to grow intentionally, that you're committing to develop and stick to a growth plan. You know, maybe it's just me, is my nature, but typically when I have an idea, the first thing that I do is that I share it. Even before I know how I'm going to bring this idea to life. And then after I've shared it, then I go and figure out how I'm going to bring this idea to life. And that has worked really, really well for me. I am more productive that way. I'm more effective that way. I know not everyone is the same way, but trust me on this one. When you share your commitment publicly, you're going to increase in a big way your accountability. Okay, so you've made a commitment to yourself. You share that commitment with others. The next step is identify in which areas is that you want to grow. Here is the difference between growing accidentally and growing intentionally. See, that year in my life that I was growing accidentally, I was taking any training, reading any book, listening to any podcast, and they were the variety of topics that I was tapping into. I can't even count how many were, right? There was no plan behind it. There was no area of focus on what were the areas where I wanted to grow. I was just growing for the sake of growing. That's the difference from accidental to intentional growth. So at this point, it is important that you identify the areas, specifically the areas on which you want to grow. The best way that I know to do this is through visualization. I've talked about visualization many times in this podcast, and I'm going to talk about it one more time because I think it's an amazing tool to help you identify the areas of growth in which you want to focus on. So what I typically do, and I do this every year, and sometimes more than once a year, I try to visualize myself in the future. I try to visualize that best version of myself, that version of myself that I want to become. And I try to visualize her as vividly as possible, or me as vividly as possible, showing as the best version of myself. What am I doing? How am I acting? What are the habits that I have? And very important, how do I feel? Because at the end of the day, no matter what goals you have or why you want to grow, we always do anything that we do because we want to feel a certain way. It's not about achieving something, it's about feeling a certain way. And we believe that achieving that will create that feeling. So when you visualize yourself, that best version of yourself, visualize how does she or he feels. That is very important. And once you visualize that best version of yourself, then you can do a little bit of a gap analysis, right? What does that version of me have that I don't have today? How is that best version of myself showing up in ways that maybe I'm not showing up today? What is she doing that I'm not doing today? What is she good at that I'm not good at today? And that can help you identify the areas in which you want to grow. And I always try to pick at any given point in time, I'm working in 2 areas of growth, all the way to 5, between 2 and 5 areas of growth. I would not recommend that you pick more than 5, because when you divide your attention among too many, you're really not making traction on any of them. For me, I pick 2 every time. And I learned this from a book from John Maxwell, and that is picking an area of choice and picking an area of skill. So, an area of choice could be mindset or perception. An area of skill could be public speaking or business acumen, right? So, I pick 2 areas that I'm going to focus on. And it is important that we see growth as a journey and not a destination. The fact that you're picking 2 areas doesn't mean that you're going to arrive at a destination in those 2 areas, and then you're going to pick another 2. That's not how it works. You develop it to a certain extent, and then you add more areas. But I don't believe you never reach a destination when it comes to growth. You're always in a journey to grow, but you are intentionally focusing on 2 areas at a time. The other thing, once you have identified what are the areas that you want to grow in, is to dedicate and allocate time for growth on a daily basis. The best way to do this is to establish routines or habits every day when you're spending time intentionally in those areas that you have identified. It can be 10 minutes, 15 minutes a day. For me, I had found that my sweet spot is 30 minutes a day. And in those 30 minutes, a lot of things can happen, right? I might be reading a book. I might be listening to a podcast. Those are 2 very popular ways to focus on an area of growth. But I believe that the best way to grow is by doing. So the application on what I'm learning when I'm reading or listening to podcasts or attending to a training, that's what really the growth is happening. Putting yourself out of your comfort zone, pushing yourself to an uncomfortable situation, that is growth. So all of those things count. It doesn't have to be only a training or a book or a podcast. And then once a week, I take time to reflect on what is that I'm learning. See, that year that I shared with you a few minutes ago, I did not have any checkpoints during the year. It was at the end of the year that I did this reflection, and then come to find out that I was not really growing. I was spending a lot of time thinking that I was growing, but I was not growing. So I like to put checkpoints every week, and this can be 10, 15 minutes, a part of my weekly planning. I just reflect and write. Maybe I journal. I write down a few bullet points on my journal on what did I learn this week. Or you can even do it at night before going to bed. What did I learn today? That is a great question to ask yourself on a regular basis, whatever regular means to you. And then the other piece that I think is very important to solidify your growth is to share your growth with someone. Share with someone what you're learning. That was one of the things that inspired me to start this podcast, because I'm not perfect. I not assumed to be perfect. I am in a journey of growth and learning. And every time that I learn something, I come here and share it with you. And that helps me continue to grow and helps me feel also fulfilled because I'm sharing that growth with you. So that's how I approach my growth plan. Once again, it is important, it is imperative that you grow intentionally. If you are going to grow, you need to be intentional. You need to plan ahead. You need to have a strategy, and you need focused effort to follow that strategy. The other thing that is very important is if you are wanting to learn in order to share, it is important to realize that first you need to invest in yourself, right? You can't help others grow if you're not growing first. The other thing that I learned through my reflection is that building self awareness is the foundation for personal growth. Self awareness is the foundation for personal growth. If you don't have a strong self awareness, you're not going to be able to identify the areas in which you need to grow. And you're not going to be able to be intentional about your growth. And you're not going to be able to assess whether you're making progress or not. So that could be an area of choice that you start focusing on as you start to develop a growth plan. Develop your self awareness, right? As I said, I invest time every day. I think it is important that we are always investing time in ourselves, and taking the time to invest in our growth is one of the best investments that you can make for yourself. The other thing that is key when you're trying to grow intentionally is to always stay curious. I was a guest on a podcast lately about learning and development, and they asked me, who inspires you? And I'll tell you that when it comes to learning and growth, my kids are my biggest inspiration. If we all could just be like kids, right? Because kids have the superpower of curiosity. You need to stay curious if you want to grow. Asking questions all the time, trying to dig into the topics, go beyond the surface, right? Being curious, remain curious is so important when we're trying to be intentional about our growth. And being curious and your curiosity can also help you identify in which areas to grow. Think about, what are you curious about? What have you been Googling about lately? Maybe those are areas that you can start to focus on as an area of growth. Okay, the other thing that has been key for me when developing my growth plan is identifying role models. You know, it is so much easier to do something, to learn something, when you have someone that has already done it. And it doesn't mean that you're going to do it exactly how they did it, but they can be a source of inspiration, and it can give you some guidance as to where to start or in what direction to go as you're planning your growth and as you're working on your growth. And ultimately, you want to become a role model for someone else. And just think about it. The same way that you look at people as role models, The reason why you look at someone as a role model is because they are ahead of you on the same journey that you're trying to get to. But if you look backwards, there's a lot of people that are behind you in that same journey that they might see you as a role model. So it is as important to identify role models to follow than being a role model yourself. And ultimately, that should be the goal, right? That you can become a role model. And ultimately, the secret ingredient for an intentional growth is consistency. I talked about this a few minutes ago. I spent half an hour every day consistently on my personal growth, and now I do it intentionally, so that half an hour I take so much more than I did when I was spending an hour a day a few years ago, because I am intentional about what I do in that hour. And if you listen to the previous episode where I talk about managing your energy, that's exactly what I'm doing. Like, after half an hour of being focused on my growth, I am not as on point. I get distracted, maybe. I'm thinking about work or the kids or anything around me. So I find that if I can give my 100% of my energy for 15 to 30 minutes every day, that is going to have a bigger impact that if I sit 3 hours on Sundays to read a full book or go through a full training. For me, little bite size every day that compound over time have been more effective in allowing me to really grow in the way that I want to grow and start to become a better version of myself. Now, I also want to take a different spin to this conversation for a minute, and that is that I know a lot of people that, like me, were spending a lot of time focusing on their personal growth, and they got to a point where they get into a burnout or a personal development paralysis. What I mean is, when you read all the things and you listen to all the things and you have so much information in your head, yes, you might be accumulating knowledge. And many people think that knowledge is power, but knowledge is only potential power, right? Applied knowledge is power. So I think that if you are currently spending, like I was, a lot of time reading books and attending trainings and listening to podcasts, you might be facing a personal development burnout or a personal development paralysis, where you have so much information in your head that you don't know where to get started to start taking action. Therefore, you don't take any action. And as I said before, the only way that you're going to grow is by taking action. Just by reading or listening or attending to a training, you're not going to grow. Is what you do with what you learn in that class, in that book, in that podcast that is going to help you grow. So if you face personal development paralysis, you're going to keep consuming content, which is great. I mean, sometimes consuming content can help us feel inspired and motivated and have positive energy, which is amazing. But if what you want is to grow, you need to stop consuming and start taking action. So if you are in that position where you're facing personal development burnout or paralysis, what I want to invite you to do is to take a pause, think on what are the areas that you really want to focus on, and put an intentional plan on how are you going to start applying all the things that you are learning. Okay, So that is what I have for you today. I hope that you liked today's podcast episode. If you did, let me ask you a big favor. Go to Apple Podcasts and leave me a review. While you're there, make sure that you subscribe so you get notifications of any new upcoming podcast episodes. And please share today's episode with anyone that you think can benefit from today's content. And with that, I hope you have an amazing week, and I will see you here again on another episode of the Leading Yourself podcast.